And welcome to our very special ACC preview on College Football Forecast. Momentarily, we'll be joined by the one, the only Jeffery Fann of Talking ACC Sports, who is one of the best. One of the best. You care about ACC sports even a little bit at all, a scintilla, a taste. You're going to love everything he does. He's one of the best, like I said. Brock will be with us at some point. He's running a bit late. But with very little ado, I will start moving us forward towards what we're talking about. The Atlantic Coast Conference, which when I was a lad, was truly an Atlantic Coast Conference. It consisted of Maryland, University of Virginia, University of North Carolina, NC State, Wake Forest, Clemson. At that point, Virginia Tech was still an independent. Miami was still an independent. Florida State was an independent. Let's see. So at the time, it was a pretty compact conference. It was from the state of Maryland, state of Virginia, a little bit of South Carolina, and very much North Carolina, right? Most of the Duke, Wake Forest, NC State, UNC made up really the most of the conference. It was a very truly regional conference in every way. And the recruiting footprint in those days, you get the occasional on basketball side, you get North Carolina, South, and even some Clemson kids would come from Georgia Tech also. Sorry, Georgia Tech. But you get kids from Atlanta, you get kids from young men from as far as all throughout North Carolina and Virginia, but especially the Tidewater area where I grew up, tended to go to the ACC. But on the basketball side, they had a bit of an ability to bring down people from New York because some of the best players, including guys like Kenny Smith, came down from places like Archbishop Malloy, Ernie Myers from Tolentine. So they had a footprint in terms of bringing those guys from what was in those days the Big East territory, came down and played basketball. But the football footprint was essentially the conference. Virginia, Maryland, D.C., North Carolina, a little bit of South Carolina, and Georgia. And that was basically it. Occasionally you get a kid from Tennessee or Florida, but they were the exception, not the rule. A lot of things have changed, and Jeffery Fann will walk us through some of the changes that have gone through, and the conference itself has changed. Obviously, geographically, with some schools that I didn't normally associate with the Atlantic Coast, having joined the conference, and then losing some old school members like Maryland. We'll just walk through what the conference looks like now, why the conference looks like it does, and what changes might be coming, and then obviously the players, the teams, what we might be looking for. So with no further ado, I'm going to bring on, like I said, the amazing Jeffery Fann, and soon we'll be joined by my co-host, Brock. So first of all, I want to say thank you so much. You are one of my favorite people, especially when it comes to the Atlantic Coast Conference, which as I said, it's changed from, first time I saw a college sporting event was NC State versus UNC when I was probably 4 years old, probably 3 years old. And Don McCauley went crazy for about 226 or so yards on NC State and blew them out. And he ended up something like 8th in the Heisman Trophy voting that year. But that was my introduction to college sports and college football. And then my first college basketball game was in the old Carmichael Auditorium, long before the Dean Dome existed, and seeing Mitch Kupchak and Tom Brust and Phil Ford and George Karl and all that bunch. But that was a very long time ago, obviously. So not Tom Brust, Matt Brust. His younger brother was Chris Brust, who played like in the late 70s there. But yes, let's talk now, because no one wants to hear about a million years ago. The Atlantic Coast Conference is in kind of a crossroads, I guess, in terms of what it's going to be, both in all sports, I suppose. Obviously, the two we talk about mostly are football and basketball, and obviously the basketball situation is probably a little more settled-ish. But football-wise, I don't know exactly what this conference is going to look like in the future. So tell me about what's going on in the Atlantic Coast Conference, and then particularly the football future, and then we'll talk about particular teams and players.
All right. First of all, thanks for having me on, Bill. Looking forward to this. With the ACC, it's a kind of a tumultuous time right now with with the Big Ten and the SEC just kind of sprinting out ahead of everyone else financially. And the ACC is in that same state as the Pac-12 and the Big 12, just trying to, solidify themselves
Right.
for the future, trying to figure out where they can find revenue, try to close that gap because it's just going to get bigger. Um, when it comes to that, though, I think there are a couple, misconceptions out there that get spread across the Twitterverse. One of them is that ESPN is going to be part of orchestrating the demise of the ACC, initiating that. Um, if I see anyone posting anything about ESPN trying to move ACC teams, I immediately know that person has no idea what they're talking about because there is no chance that ESPN is going to be trying to do this for a property they already own and have a very profitable ACC network. But what really comes down to with this revenue topic is the media deal, the base media deal. And what's not a good deal for the ACC becomes a very good deal for ESPN. They're getting a lot of content and some valuable brands for a bargain basement price.
Right.
So that's the first thing. It could be that ESPN at some point reacts to something else that happens in the marketplace, or from another conference, but they're not going to initiate the demise of the ACC. Absolutely not. They're not going to be working to move teams to the Big Ten and the SEC. It's absolutely ridiculous.
Right.
Um, Second, they do have that grant of rights, and there's not some magical loophole that's going to become suddenly apparent, or else Texas and Oklahoma would have left the Big 12 a couple of years ago.
Right.
This is a very strong document written by lawyers, and doesn't mean, I'm not saying someone may not challenge it at some point, but I would say confidently nothing is going to happen with the ACC members for at least the next 5 years. Um, and I think it'd probably even be into the 2030s, maybe 2030, um, before anything significant may happen. And in that time, this is where the ACC has to work to generate their revenues. And to me, you can blame the deal if you want to, but knowing that you inherited that and you now have 5 or 6 years to work on it. If you can't figure out a solution in 6 years, if you're the commissioner, Jim Phillips, that doesn't become the predecessor's problem. That becomes your problem. So they have about a half a decade to really work on this, and that's what they need. That's what they need to be doing.
Yeah. As has been pointed out by both people who do know what they're talking about and people who
Yeah,
maybe don't. The ACC, as you said, is in this sort of middle place between these two juggernauts that you just
yeah,
named, who have
no
this
question.
very strong position, essentially sort of sitting on top, with the SEC sitting on the very, very top and the Big Ten not far below them. And then everyone else scurrying for position, hopefully as close to right beneath them as possible.
Exactly.
And I think some of what the ACC has working for it is now that they have sort of metastasized and they're sort of established now physically in the New York market and physically in far down as South Florida, they should have a lot to offer. And once again, quality sports. I mean, football is the sport that sort of moves the needle, but terrific baseball programs. If you care about lacrosse, a lot of the best lacrosse programs in our country are in the conference.
Exactly. And I think
Golf,
yeah,
tennis.
yeah, that's a good point. Golf, Georgia Tech just played for the national championship
Yep.
in golf, and I think the ACC led all conferences with the most national championships in this past calendar year. I mean, you always look at who's won the football national championship, in men's basketball. But I mean, these other sports, they count too when it comes to these totals. And I think the ACC won nine NCAA championships across sports like lacrosse and women's golf. I mean, athletically, the conference is still extremely viable. They they've put three teams into the Final Four in the last 2 years. It's supposed to be a down period for ACC basketball.
So
And
it kills me as I keep hearing that the Big 12 and SEC have caught up with the ACC. Well, not in the tournament they haven't.
yeah, that's where it counts. Hey, I mean, at the end of the day, it's how you do in March, not how you do in January. And and right now, the ACC is still producing at an extremely high level in basketball. I mean, you've had Duke, North Carolina, um, Miami this year reaching to the Final Four after an Elite Eight season, and the ACC last year, had the best record in the ACC. I mean, the NCAA tournament,
Right.
and I think combined over the last 2 years, they're either first or second. So when it comes to March, they're producing. You mentioned baseball. Wake Forest was a top three team this year. Um, came within an eyelash of knocking off LSU. So they reached the Final Four, and they were ranked number one for a good portion of the season. Virginia Tech reached the Final Four in women's basketball. So, I mean, they're very competitive um, across the landscape of athletics. They didn't get a college football playoff team, but I mean, they did still have two teams finish in the top 12 in the country with Clemson and Florida State, and both are likely to enter next season in the top 10.
Right. Both should be better. I mean, from based
Yep.
on my expectations, which are not always correct. But I look at Florida State's roster; it's a better roster than it was last year.
Yeah,
When I
it's
look at
loaded.
Clemson, right? Clemson has I mean, there's some question marks at certain key positions, which I know we'll talk about later.
Mhm.
But and there's always a big if, but they have a lot of 4 and 5 stars sprinkled all across that roster. And
Mhm.
if 60%, if 6 out of 10 of these players are what they're supposed to be, they should be a really good team. And you mentioned Wake Forest, obviously, in baseball. Wake Forest, don't sleep on Wake Forest in any sport. Wake Forest is the kind of team that kind of sneaks up and bam, whacks you over the head. It's like, wait, Wake Forest won 10 games in football? I mean, I will not be surprised at all
Yeah.
if they win 10 games again. I don't know why they would all of a sudden. I mean, Sam Hartman's gone, but the rest of that roster is pretty good. I mean, you don't bring back A.T. Perry, and they lost one of their better offensive linemen, but I would say overall the talent level could be better
Yeah, I mean,
across that.
Dave Clawson has a solid foundation there at Wake Forest. I mean, they're a perennial bowl team, and if you go about maybe the last 4 years, they've probably been one of the four best ACC football programs, and
Yeah,
and Pitt might be one of the top two. You kind of forget about Pittsburgh. Pat Narduzzi has really put together a quality program. Won an ACC title last year, won 9 games,
right,
and beat a top 20 UCLA team in the Sun Bowl. Uh,
right.
I mean, that there's a little bit of depth to the ACC in football that we hadn't seen the last 3 or 4 years, and you saw that. I know with all the opt outs and stuff that bowl season isn't quite as significant as it's been, but I mean the results still, do matter to a certain extent. And it was their first winning bowl season in 3 or 4 years, and that still counts.
Right. Well, there's all the sort of you know uh, Capital One Cup, but I
Yeah.
mean beyond that, there's just the bragging rights. I mean,
Yep.
we keep getting the SEC shoved down our throats every year. Well, I mean, and deservedly so. They play a high level of football every year. The good Lord sends. I get that,
Yep.
but it is worth noting that, as you just said, there are, I would say, 4 or 5 very quality teams in the conference that I think are all in the teams that I think have a legitimate shot at double-digit wins. We already mentioned Florida State. We already mentioned Clemson. We sort of kind of mentioned Miami, which is a little more of a, sounds funny to say that, more of a dark horse team to win
Yep.
10 games, which, not that long ago would have been crazy to say. But they are a so weird to say they're a rising program in a conference, but they're a rising program, at least in the Atlantic Coast Conference recently. And I could see them breaking through and be having a shot to win 9 or 10 games. Wake Forest is always lurking. And I think we'll see. I mean, NC State is always interesting. I don't know what they'll be like this year. They're sort of a mystery. But my favorite sort of dark horse watch out for team this year when I look at their roster and I watch the tape from last year's Maryland. And Maryland was capable they were very unpredictable. They were capable of looking like a team that was very dangerous at times. When I got to go to the combine and talk to the Ohio State wide receivers, I said, toughest secondary you faced. They didn't mention, anybody that you thought they mentioned. They mentioned Maryland. They mentioned those Maryland corners gave them fits. So now those guys are all now in the NBA, NFL. Well, not all of them. I think most of them are in the NFL. The two big ones, obviously, are in the Banks and Bennett. But they are onto something. Mike Locksley is onto something. I think that they are maybe one more year away, if he keeps recruiting well, from being a real threat. But if they won 9 games this year, wouldn't shock me. And if you can win 9, you can win 10. So I'm intrigued. Let's break it down. Now we're talking about this. Who are some teams in the conference that you think people aren't talking about enough?
I think you mentioned one of them already when you talked about NC State. They're a little bit under the radar going into this year. Last year, a lot of people thought it was going to be their breakout season with Devin Leary. They got ranked in the top 10. Then he gets hurt and they have a little bit of issue with consistency at quarterback.
Right.
But they got in one of the potentially best transfers this year coming into the season in Brennan Armstrong. I think they're going to be really good on defense this year. Peyton Wilson, they're all ACC linebackers back. They've been pretty stout defensively, and the reason I'm looking at them as a possible dark horse is if Brennan Armstrong returns to the form that he had at Virginia 2 years ago, where he was just lighting up every defense in the ACC, that offense plus that defense is going to be a real load to handle. And he's reunited with the offensive coordinator he had at Virginia, Robert and I.
Speaking of underrated, how has Robert and I never been a head coach? But I'm sorry, I'm going to let you go back.
That's a good point.
Go ahead.
I mean, if they get anything like what they saw out of Brennan Armstrong from 2 years ago at Virginia, NC State goes from a little bit off the radar to a definite top 20 caliber team. So they're one of the teams a little bit off the radar that I think could potentially make some noise. And same with Pittsburgh. We talked about them a little bit, and we know Narduzzi has put together a really solid foundation, and he's getting the transfer in from Boston College, Phil Yurkovich, and he can play too. Yes. He just had a terrible offensive line at Boston College.
He got hurt.
And he was running for his life.
Right. I mean, he got hurt. And Grossell, no offense to Mr. Grossell, but there was a pretty decent sized drop off between the two. Because, I mean, he starts his career, I believe, at Notre Dame as a highly touted prospect coming into Notre Dame, ends up transferring and is beginning to, take off. And I heard some sort of low-level first-round buzz at one point around his name, and then he said, the offensive line, he gets beaten half to death, and eventually has to leave. If you know what returning to form, if he gets protection, returns to form, I mean, he's got some almost Roethlisberger-esque kind of qualities. Not quite as athletic, but big guy, big arm, tough as nails, tough to the point where he eventually got beaten up so badly. But when people say, like, what sort of players have a chance to sort of come out of nowhere and push their way towards the first round, that's another guy who could do that.
Yeah. And I look at him, and we saw some glimpses of what he could do at Boston College. If he can put a full season together with probably with a better overall team at Pittsburgh, Pittsburgh is another one of those under the radar teams. Now, it's going to take a lot to overtake Clemson and Florida State because they're so talented. Florida State is they're really loaded. They're loaded as they've been in about 6 or 7 years across across the board. I mean, they have a great quarterback who I think is going to be in the running for the Heisman, Jordan Travis, who really has those intangibles. As a leader out there. I mean, they
Right.
knocked off LSU early in the season last year. You talk about, ACC, SEC, that tends to get forgotten that, an ACC team, knocked off the second best team in the
Right.
SEC, played in the SEC title game. But I think Florida State has a chance to be really, really good. And, and then Clemson, especially on the defensive side of the ball,
Yep.
they've got talent all through that starting 11, and they're deep. Um, I don't think Wes Godwin had a great season as defensive coordinator. He was pretty inexperienced, and
Right.
I don't think he utilized the talent as good as he could have. But say if he takes a leap as a coach, the talent's there to be a top 5, top 10 defense. And then it becomes with Clemson, how does the transition from DJ Uyangale to Cade Klubnik go? Who steps up at wide receiver, where I think there could be some question marks at the skill position for
Right.
Clemson outside of Will Shipley. Um, but if they start getting some contributions at wide receiver, and some of the guys progress the way they could, and you got Garrett Riley now from TCU, the hot offensive coordinator. you
Right.
know and you said this already, Bill. I mean, I expect Clemson to be better. I expect Florida State to be at what they were in the second half of the season, with more consistency through the whole season. And you got two really, strong teams at the top that, we talked about the under the radar teams. They're going to have to do quite a lot to overtake Clemson and Florida State.
Right. Right. I mean, both those teams have a chance to literally run the table. I mean, they could easily, not easily, but they could conceivably. Each team is good enough to have a chance to go be undefeated,
Yep.
which unfortunately may be what it takes for an ACC team to get back into the Final Four, because the conference lost a little respect, I think, in people's eyes, unfairly to some extent. I think the parity that we saw the last couple of years should have made people think the conference was better, but oddly enough, it made people disparage the conference. The fact that there was no one single running roughshod dominant team, oddly enough, hurt the conference, where there were a lot of teams that were sort of bunched together. I think that will change, as you just said. I think there's sort of two teams that will be battling it out for the top spot, and whoever emerges, I think, is a team that could get back towards being looked at as a Final Four type team in terms of the college football playoffs. Let's talk about some of those. You mentioned some transfers, and obviously the transfer portal is almost as big as recruiting now. I mean, it's
Yeah, that's
it's
true.
simply a second major recruiting tool in your tool belt as a recruiter and as a coach. We mentioned obviously Brendan Armstrong already. Who are some other high impact transfer portal players you're looking at this year?
Well, Jurkovic was a transfer from Boston College, so we've already, talked about two of the better transfers in the ACC with Jurkovic and Brennan Armstrong. Another really strong transfer for Florida State, who's really, taking care of business in the transfer portal, is at tight end. I mean, they already have a pretty loaded team, but then they pick up Jaheim Bell from South
Oh,
Carolina,
yes, yes.
who had some all SEC votes here and there the last couple years, and now he's at Florida State getting Jordan Travis, another weapon. And the day he walks onto Florida State, he's probably one of the two or three best tight ends in the ACC.
Right.
So that was a huge pickup for Florida State. Um, you know, there at Miami, um, the offensive line was uh, inconsistent, we'll say, last
Yes, it's
year,
kind
trying
of
to
you.
protect
Yes.
trying to protect Tyler Van Dyke, and we saw how he went from a preseason, you know, looked like an NFL prospect going into last season to almost wanting to transfer. But
Yes.
yeah, they picked up a really good transfer from Central Florida, an all-conference center, Matt Lee, who
Right.
should help solidify that offensive line. And if Mario Cristobal, who already first season at Miami was getting some naysayers.
Yeah, the seat warmed up pretty quickly.
That didn't take long at all. Uh, but I mean, there's some talent there at Miami, and I don't think there's not enough to really get into the mix with Clemson and Florida State, but there's enough that I mean they can be a factor in the ACC and win 8 or 9 games, and getting a transfer like Lee on the offensive line should really help. So, between Lee, Bell, Jerkovic, and Armstrong. Those are some maybe some of the 3 or 4 most significant transfers. Another one, Nate McCollum, who transferred to North Carolina from Georgia Tech. He was probably Georgia Tech's most consistent, best receiver, and now he goes to North Carolina, play with Drake May, with the departure of Josh Downs. So I think he could potentially have a big season.
Yeah. First of all, shout out to the man for strategic planning and thinking. That's let's see. Who has a chance to be the first player taken in the next draft? Oh, Drake May. Who just lost his favorite target? Oh, Drake May.
Yeah. And it's not that I don't think, I think Georgia Tech will be a much improved team too. But yeah, from his point of view, he was like, I'm just going to go to somewhere that's going to throw it 40 times a game.
Right. And I mean, I just recently wrote an article about Drake May. And of course, because I'm 1,000 years old, Jeffrey, I got to watch see his father play. In fact, they had a little run up, though no relation. They had another quarterback right named Deems May, but spelled M-A-Y. And they were all 6'4", 6'5", these giant dudes with big arms. But the difference with Drake May is he's a giant dude with a big arm who can run. His dad was essentially an oak tree back there, right? He was a big, strong guy, but he didn't move at all. And now I'm looking at his, obviously he had 2 brothers who played basketball at Carolina.
Yep.
Very athletic family. Right. And of course, Drake was a very good basketball player in high school. So very athletic bunch of dudes. And I'm excited by a lot of things, obviously, but he's a player who has a legitimate shot to be a Heisman Trophy finalist if they have. I mean, just in the conference, right? We talked about Brennan Armstrong. At one point, he was a dark horse, maybe not to win, but at least be invited to New York. But he's back at his best time at Virginia. If he bounces back, that's a possible Heisman Trophy finalist. We talked somewhat briefly about, Jerkovic, maybe not, but even if we talk about Jordan Travis, that's a guy who has a very legitimate chance to be invited to New York. Maybe even a chance to win if Florida State has the year they might have. And now Drake May, who's going to put up, I think, insanity numbers this year. I think he's going to be. I mean, we saw Sam Howell put himself on the Vince Young. What was that list? It's the young that it's I think Vince Young, Kyler Murray. It's a short list of like quarterbacks who've passed for over 3,500 and rushed for over 800 yards. I think it's a short list, and I think he's on it. I think Drake May has a shot to put his name on that list, depending upon what happens to the running game. So before we move on, I want to ask about, we talked about transfers in, out, etc. Also, some big-time recruits came into the conference. This has been a good year, particularly for the best recruiters in the conference. Reminded you that they're the best recruiters in the conference, as if you needed reminding. Walk me through some of the best recruiting classes, and then if there's some under-the-radar recruits that maybe aren't at the top of people's minds or aren't being talked about enough. Feel free to mention those as well. But who are the you think really brought in a bumper crop of talent into the conference in the recruiting season?
Yeah. And I mean, and I don't follow probably recruiting as closely as you do, but one of the recruits that I saw him in the spring game, and I think he's just adding more to that Clemson depth is the Woods kid out of Alabama.
Right.
I mean, you could tell right off the bat that he was a talent. And he was athletic, and I'm just like, man, wait till this guy gets a little bit of experience under his belt. I mean, he's
and
just going to be
stronger, and
yeah, he's going to be a monster, and just add to that, defensive line grouping at Clemson that's just been, so good over the last several years.
Yeah, I agree. And I think that the one thing I will say about the ACC as a whole, and not that they have, once again, maybe the same cachet recruiting wise that you find in the SEC or even the Big Ten,
Mm-hmm.
sometimes in the Pac-12, just from pure, cachet, maybe more attention is paid. But when you look at NFL drafts, because that's the final arbiter of just how much talent you're actually producing, right? Does the NFL think these guys are good? You still see a lot of players from Clemson. You're still seeing a lot of players. I mean, Maryland had a really nice year just past in terms of players being drafted. So, that's really where I sort of taking guys from college to the pros, and I'm looking at the trends. And Carolina is doing well now, and I think that they're about to become a decent conduit of guys passing through that program into the NFL. I think Sam Howell's going to have a good. It's not his rookie year officially, but his first year really playing, I think he's going to sort of help to reestablish that, because he's a really talented guy. And I think people not forgot, it's only been 1 year, but maybe the year that he had, his last year there, really having to carry the offense so much himself, both running and passing, was a little bit unfair to him. But I think it prepared him physically for the beating because he took some shots. And while you don't want quarterbacks being hit that much, when you are taking that step, college to pro, that's one of the things they always say. Can you handle, the physical aspect of it? Well, I saw, first of all, Sam Howell's very physically built. He's a 226-pound guy, and he's not the tallest cat in the world, but he's, pretty solidly put together. And he's not afraid of contact, but you don't want him taking a lot of it. But yes, I think as a conference as a whole, the ACC has done better, I think, as a whole than I think they are generally given credit for. I think that obviously Clemson, we have come to expect Clemson. Clemson's almost like a de facto SEC team to some extent in the expectations. But I mean, Miami had a tremendous recruiting season.
Yeah, they did, and we were talking about that offensive line. Well, they might have fixed it in a hurry here with a couple 5-star offensive linemen that they picked up. So Cristobal, he's obviously seeing the same thing. Even the casual, well, I like you would expect, but the casual fan can see, hey, they need help on the offensive line, and then Cristobal goes out and picks up 2 5-stars on the offensive line. So that's
right.
they should do a lot better.
In Oklahoma, right? Possibly a future first-round draft pick, and Francois Magoa, who was another guy that has a maybe not first-round talent, but probably a top 100 prospect one day in terms of going to the NFL. So boom, and of course a former offensive lineman himself. So I would imagine that he looked at, as you said, at that line and said, "Nope, this just won't do."
Yeah, exactly.
I'll mention 2 other guys I like from that recruiting class. That kid Collins Onchapong, I think he reminds me a little bit of like Matthias Kiwanuka, the former Boston College guy.
Mm-hmm.
Had a nice little run in college and played with the Giants in the NFL. He's got tremendous length and moves well for a guy who's that long and that strong. I'm a fan also of Robert Stafford, the corner they brought in. Another kid from Melbourne, Florida. Speed, quickness, feet, ball skills, all the things you look for. I think he's got a chance to be really good. And one other guy I'll mention is Bobby Washington. They got into that class, who I think he has a chance to be sort of that Sterling Shepard type, right? That run after the catch, turn a screen pass into a punt return kind of guy. I like him as well. And Clemson always does it well. I mean, at least in the Dabo Swinney era, has always done very well. And this year is no different. 1 5-star and a I don't know, seemingly like 1,000 4-stars, but a lot of those 4 and 3 stars are going to end up being better than people think. They also do a good job of developing. Now they got slow off the mark. You mentioned Peter Woods already, and I think Dabo, for whatever reason, seemed resistant to the portal at first, and so I think that hurt them for a while. They didn't seem to be very active or very good at it, for lack of a better way of putting it. But I think that's starting to change. I think they're sort of warming up to what the portal can do for them. But I think Vic Burley, though he's a 4-star, he's a 5-star to me. I don't know. I don't know. When I watched it, I was like, well, why is he not a 5-star? I mean, I'm sure there's a reason, but I don't see it. He's big, strong, and fast. Yet another 6'5", 276-pound guy who's probably going to run low 4.7s. Why that's not 5-star, I don't know, but he's going to be good. And he comes from a really good program in Warner Robins. They have Tamarion Parker. I mean, their defensive line depth is silly, and they added more.
And they really tore it up this past June on picking up more elite defensive players. So Clemson's not going. They're not going anywhere.
They're not going anywhere, except once again, maybe to push their way back into the college football playoffs. At least they have a chance at it. I think they'll be an ACC team this year. I do. I truly believe that either Clemson or Florida State gets back there again. I think that we're back to, I don't know what you would call it, norm, and it's not the norm necessarily, but I think that we're back to at least one ACC team represented, at least, one Big 12, maybe one Big 12, or definitely one Big 10. I think the SEC may only have one representative this year. I don't know. We'll see. I mean, Alabama's not going anywhere, obviously, but Georgia's looks. I mean, I'll never say any team's unbeatable, but good God. I mean,
they got the perfect storm of an incredibly soft schedule and maybe the most talented roster in college football. I mean,
that's a pretty good combination, Jeff.
I mean, you look at their schedule and you're like, "Come on, is this even serious?" But I mean,
what are we doing here? What is? It is not the most difficult schedule. You are correct.
I think they're going to be double-digit.
Schedule, yeah.
I think they're going to be double-digit favorites in probably every game they play until the SEC championship game.
Right.
And,
Right. And might still be. Well, we'll see. Maybe not double-digit, but they may be favored by at least one score in every game they play the entire season, including possibly the SEC championship game. So yeah, I agree that this is a champion schedule. Whatever, I get it, I guess, but I'm a little disappointed, I guess. And then I do want to talk a little about Louisville. Now, Louisville is, they're not bringing in 5-stars, but they're bringing in some really good players. And I think one or two of them are going to have an immediate impact. I think that you might see maybe Aaron Williams play early at corner. California kid from St. John Bosco. He's got length. I'm not ready to compare him to like Charles Woodson or whatever. Some people have gone a little nuts, but he's being compared to some good players. And he think he will be good. Maybe not that good, but he'll be very good, I believe. I like Madison Sanker, who they brought in to probably play guard for them. I wouldn't be shocked if he at least saw some snaps as a freshman. And then Adonijah Green, who is an interesting pass rusher, came in from Cedar Grove.
Yeah, got him out of Georgia too.
Right. Now he's a guy that needs to eat. You can tell he's gotten away with it. He's generously listed, I think, at 207 pounds. He's probably, after practice, he's probably about 199. But but he's loose and quick and uses his hands well and has good length. He just needs he may not make an immediate impact just because he's so darn light, but by this time next year when he's 229 pounds or whatever, I could see him being one of those people that just burst onto the scene, once he finally has his, as my aunt used to say, his man's body. But I like what they've done, even though it's not, as super splashy. And I'll give you one other guy I think sees the field fairly early on in his time there is Luke Burgess, an offensive lineman. Once again, needs to put on about 20, 25 pounds, but I think he's going to end up playing for them and playing well for them from New Palestine, from Indiana, of all places. But how he got him past all those MAC schools and all those Big Ten schools, who knows? But I mean, it's not that far, I guess, from Indiana. And I guess by law, I have to mention both, Florida State, North Carolina, Virginia Tech. Florida State, obviously, even when they've had quote unquote down years, always bring in good players. And I think particularly this year, I mean, Hakeem Williams
I love that pickup at wide receiver.
he's potentially a star. I mean, like big time. He's got, once again, first round potential. I mean, it's very early on, obviously, but a guy that looks like that, moves like that, catches the ball like that. I mean, I'm not ready to call him, AJ Green or anything like that, but he's got some stuff to work with. He's got some things to work with. Yeah, he could be something. I like the linebacker Blake Nicholson. I like Conrad Hussey. But the one I really, really like is the giant offensive lineman, Lucas Simmons. I could see him playing, maybe not once again, not right away, but I wouldn't be surprised if he ends up second on the depth chart, and maybe being a guy that plays in certain situations, or if somebody gets hurt, I could see him stepping in and at least acquitting himself fairly well. And last but not least, I'll mention Keith Sampson, who, of course, North Carolina was also hopefully trying to land. They were not able to. He ends up at Florida State. But he's another guy who's that, classic pass rusher type, quick, strong, can really explode in the last few steps, knows how to get low, doesn't know a bunch of moves yet because he's never needed them. He's just used to just flat out beating guys, which works all throughout your time in high school, and might even work in college to some extent, but he'll start to pick up a few things. And then I feel like I have to mention Carolina's class. Mac Brown has been criticized at times for certain things. Sometimes people call his programs too soft. People say things, and once again, I don't know what constitutes a soft program exactly, but I'll say this much: he's brought more talent through the door at Carolina the past few years than anybody else was. Maybe no 5 stars, but a good number of 4 stars in the class. And I think at least 2 of them will see the field fairly early in their careers. If not flat out starters, then at least rotational players. Now, obviously, the big name is Chris Culliver, and he has a chance to. He's once again super skinny. Another guy that needs to, get in the weight room and say hello to his new friend, Mr. Protein Shake. but I remember being thin at one point, Jeff. But age and whatever will take care of it eventually. But he's another guy that, draws a lot of those comparisons to those long, lean-bodied receiver types with the long arms and big hands and like they're just skinny. He'll put on probably another 20 pounds in his collegiate career, but at the moment he's probably on a good day he's probably about 177 pounds and he's like 6'2" and a half. So yeah, he'll put on some weight. I like Tyler Thompson a lot as well. He's another one of those skinny, rangy pass rusher types who once he gets finished filling out will be something. And the last one I'll mention, who's a big body on the interior, is Joel Starlings from Benedictine in Richmond, Virginia. He may not play right away simply because he's got to adjust. He just dominated in high school. And Benedictine didn't always play the highest level of competition in high school. So he's going to take a while to just adjust to the fact that he's got, there's other 310-pound people who can move in the world. That's a sort of a shock to you when you first get out of high school sometimes. But once he adjusts, I can see him being a really good impact player. And then you mentioned NC State. I mentioned NC State. So I'm going to mention NC State's recruiting class. And they aren't maybe the juggernaut recruiters that some of their schools you mentioned are. But they found some players who I think will play early on for them too. And they do have to fill in some holes, quite frankly, right? They lost some guys, some to the transfer portal and some to a couple to the NFL. But I feel like amongst the guys they brought in who I think will play fairly early, I think Darion Rivers is a very much not undersized. He's just underweight offensive tackle. But man, once he puts on, so once again, he may even redshirt, but give him a year. when he gets into the 290s, because he moves extremely well, and officially a 3-star, probably because of his weight, but he's not going to be 255, 260 forever, kids. He's gonna fill out. I like the tight end, Javonte Vereen. Once again, underweight, 209 pounds, but he'll be 230 before you know it and can run, right? I mean, that's the thing. He's one of the guys who can stretch the seam. He can take off, and linebackers won't be able to stay with him. Some safeties will struggle to stay with him. And the last guy I'll mention is Kendrick Raphael. And he's, once again, a running back, but he looks like a wide receiver, and he can catch the ball a little bit fast. Once again, could use some, a little more meat on his bones, but which is sort of a theme with some of these teams. NC State got a lot of like lean dudes too. I noticed not a lot of 310 pounders for them, but he has a chance to be good. And then, is there any other team that you think had a recruiting class that made people? You mentioned, I think you mentioned Pitt also, and Pitt is not really thought of as a juggernaut recruiter either, but they added 1 or 2 players that I also think are really better than people maybe think they are. Shadarian Harrison is not being discussed enough in my worldview, and officially he's a 3-star, so maybe that's why. I think he's going to outplay that rating. I think he's going to play, once again, skinny, but I think he's going to play. I think he's going to play, if not, full time, probably in maybe certain package situations when you have to put, maybe when the team goes 4 or 5 wide, you'll maybe see the field then. I like Isaiah Neal. I think he's going to see the field, maybe not in the first part of the season while he adjusts. Baltimore kid, shout out to my friends from like Matt and others, Baltimore friends, but he, you know him well from St. Francis. And then I guess the big-ish name they brought in from my neck of the woods, the Tidewater, #757football, is Gordon Bass from Phoebus High out there on the peninsula, where my godbrother was a high jumper. Shout out to retired Colonel Christopher Gerdine, who now works for the State Department. But yes, he competed in track triple jump and high jump against people like Al Toon, who later went on to play with the Jets in the NFL. Yep. And at one point, Al Toon held the state triple jump record for years until my former teammate Matt Darby broke it. Shout out to Matt Darby, who went on to play at UCLA and then later with the Bills and the Arizona Cardinals. But I like what Pitt did, and even though they don't have as many big names as some of the other programs, I think they did well. And then I'll give one last sleeper. Not even sleeper's too strong a word, but maybe people didn't notice this class as much as they should have. So the Virginia Polytechnic Institute, right, which people call Virginia Tech for short, is a program that was a traditional 9-10 win, 11 sometimes win the team for seems like almost 2 decades. And now they've fallen upon hard-ish times. Letting Hendon Hooker slip through their fingers probably wasn't the best move either. I was not a fan of them not playing him more, but yay, here we are now. He found his place. He found where he should be. But they now have a chance to, I think, turn some of this around. They brought in some players who I think will see the field. I think that Aiden Green, once again, very thin, but he's going to be. I guess that's what happens when you're young and run around a lot. But he's going to be a good player for them. Kid from Tennessee kid. I think he's going to play for them. Chance Fitzgerald, also from Tennessee. He's going to come in. He's going to be two really good wide receivers that they brought in, who I think are going to play reasonably early on. And then Laith Ganem, who he can play either tackle or guard. I think they see him as a guard. I think he can play tackle, but it's just me. They may not believe it, but whatever happens, I think he'll end up seeing the field a little bit. But here's a guy that I think, of all the guys I've mentioned, maybe has the most immediate impact, is a junior college guy named James Jeanette from College of the Canyons. And I think the guys I'm mentioning are guys going to need some seasoning. I think he may be on the field pretty much right away. Another sort of lanky guy, 6'4" and change, about 227 or so pounds. I think that right out of the box, he's going to see the field in certain pass rush situations, and then he might become a full-time starter before the season's over. And then I'm going to mention a corner, Antonio Cotman Jr., officially a 3-star. Once again, I'm not sure exactly how ratings work. I looked at him and thought, why is this guy not at least a 4-star? Who knows? But long, fast, good ball skills from Life Christian Academy. So once again, didn't play against the world's highest level competition. Maybe that's why. From Colonial Heights in the state of Virginia. Maybe that's why he didn't play against like the big time programs. So maybe that's why he was a little bit slept on. But I like him. Now I want to talk about some of the things that you think could be happening. So people are saying the ACC needs to add or subtract or both programs. Some people think that it just needs to gobble up some programs. Hey, West Virginia, tired of having to fly all over the Southwest? I mean, you tell me, do you think the ACC still tries to add teams? And if so, who do you think? Do you think they're eye on Liberty? Or just you tell me, what are you hearing or what are you thinking may happen in terms of the conference changing shape, in terms of maybe adding teams or shedding teams?
Yeah, they did say that they looked at, a couple of expansion targets over the last year. I think they even mentioned Oregon and Washington because of the Pac-10's issues right now.
Yeah.
SMU.
Oh,
There was a fourth team I know that they had spent some time looking, but I can't quite remember it. But and there probably were several others. But I think the issue at the moment is that none of these teams programs show enough ability to raise the value of the ACC's media deal,
right.
um, and I think that's why you've seen Oregon and Washington not yet be added to the Big Ten, for example. Um, these contracts now have gotten so big, and that's a whole nother thing we could talk on for like a half hour. You look at the SEC and Big Ten. I mean, their contracts are so gigantic. I mean, who out there outside of maybe Notre Dame is going to be additive to those deals?
Yeah,
You
that's
know,
the list. The list is Notre Dame. Yeah.
the
You
list
named
is
it.
Notre Dame. Apologies to Washington, Oregon, and Florida State and Kansas basketball.
Right.
Those conferences have $100 million deals. Uh, going forward, and that means you have to add X amount of dollars to raise that up. Doesn't mean they won't necessarily try to expand at some point, but it doesn't make it the slam dunk people seem to think it is. Um, for the ACC, though, I think they're going to be in a holding pattern for the moment, especially because everyone's waiting on what the Pac-12 is going to do.
Right.
Because if they don't get that deal done, it could set off a list set off a domino effect that teams could be moving all over the place again. Honestly, I prefer to see them get it done because I think college athletics is better with 5 viable conferences. If they break up, I mean the eventuality is just the Big Ten and the SEC, and even if a third conference remains in some kind of existential form, I mean, you know, it's only going to be existing by name. They
Ugh.
won't have any power whatsoever in any of the decision making or teams that fill the playoffs. It's just going to be, just existing. So I think it's better when there's 5. So I'm rooting for the Pac-12 to get it done.
Agreed. Um, Obviously, Notre Dame has at various times treated the ACC as a sneaky link.
Yeah.
Um, do you think there's any opportunity for the ACC to be a legitimate suitor for real, like in the light of day with Notre Dame, or will Notre Dame continue to sort of treat the ACC as, like I said, its dirty little secret?
Yeah, I think the chances are pretty low. Um, I've kind of come to respect Notre Dame in a way of they're going to hold on to their independence as long as they can, which is actually kind of a neat thing in college athletics.
Right.
That if you're kind of a traditionalist, you're looking at Notre Dame and saying, man, they probably could have moved conferences and make even more than what they do make.
Right.
They could have joined the Big Ten, prior to their deal with the ACC. Could have joined them anytime in the last, you know, 20 years,
Right.
and
One
never
more.
did.
Yeah.
So in a strange way, I've come to kind of admire, how hard they've tried to keep their independence, and I really expect them to continue to do that at least over the next 10 years. I mean, they're gonna work with the ACC as a partner in the other sports, but they're gonna keep that football independence, I believe.
Right. And I don't blame them. And I've come to, I mean, when I was a kid, I was like, what are they messing around with? Why don't they just go ahead and join the Big Ten? But at this point, as like you, I've come around on it partially because of all of the mergers and acquisitions and everything. It's sort of cool to see somebody say, no, we're good. Um,
Exactly.
like
Kind of
that's
buck the trend of the
right.
instant money grab.
Right. Right. What's the line from oh, you will be assimilated, right? The Borg.
Yeah,
It's
yeah.
good to see. It's good to see somebody push in the other direction. And then before we close out, I do want to talk. We talked about obviously a little bit of the past, mostly the present, and a little bit, a decent amount about the future. But I want to go back to the present. So, looking at the ACC as currently constituted, we've talked about teams that we think are going to do very, very well. And I like focusing on the positive, but there's always got to be a little bit of negative.
Yeah.
Are there programs, coaches, et cetera, that are in trouble? Are there people that you think might be fighting for their lives and maybe might not win that fight in terms of holding on to their coaching positions, and maybe there might be some turnover in the conference in terms of coaching staffs?
Um, I think a lot of the coaches, are entering that year or two where you're not likely to see a coach fired after 2 years. But we did mention Mario Cristobal. If he has another poor season, I mean, they're not going to be very patient with him at Miami.
Yeah,
I
if they're 2-5, a little past the halfway point in the season, yeah, he might get Lane Kiffined.
Yeah, so I would highly recommend that they at least win 8 games this year. Um, I think Tony Elliott could be in a little bit of trouble. Now, the expectations at Virginia are a lot lower than they are at Miami. I wouldn't. I would say under almost no circumstance would he be fired this year, but he would have some heat on him, going into that third season if they struggle as much as they did most of last year. And then he did have to deal with the tragic events at the end of at Virginia. So yeah, that was just tragic and terrible. And on that, he did an exemplary job of kind of rallying his team. So former Clemson assistant,
Yeah.
we're rooting for him to do well there. But we'll see how he does his second year. But of teams and coaches that maybe really need to produce something this year, it's probably Dino Babers at Syracuse.
Hmm.
They had the one kind of magical year 3 or 4 years ago, but in last year started out 6-0 and then just kind of free fall the rest of the year when the schedule turned. He probably needs a decent season, and he is a good coach,
Yeah.
but it's tough to get top end players to Syracuse. And then Jeff Hafley there at Boston College, who I also think is a quality coach, but they didn't hire him to kind of produce at the same level that Steve Adazio did with the 6-7, 5-6-7 wins a year. I mean, looked like he had opportunities to elevate him, and then it just hadn't happened yet. And he's entering his, I think, either his third or fourth season, and it's probably about that time for him to really start producing. So of the coaches going into this season that probably need to put something together, I would probably say Hafley and Dino Babers.
Yeah, and I agree 100%. And she said they're both really good coaches, and they're both in some somewhat challenged situations recruiting
Yeah.
wise, right? The state of Massachusetts has a decent number of good programs, but they don't produce some positions, right? You can get offensive linemen, you can get linebackers. Great wide receivers, a little hard to come by. Great corners, a little hard to come by in that part of the country. Tight ends, you can get You can get quarterbacks, but it seems to be hard to find defensive linemen. It seems to be hard to be like especially defensive end types, your pass rusher types. Their best pass rusher on the team is a guy who transferred up from Albany, right, Jared Verse. So yeah, they've got to really work the portal, and they didn't do a great job in the portal as far as I could tell. So that's what you have to do with some of these schools is just be killing it in the portal. Get guys to come up from smaller programs who were just flat out killing it. And then Syracuse, right? I mean, only bring recruits certain times of year, right? That's got to be your strategy. Like work together with your meteorological program to figure out when you should invite recruits.
Right.
Because because I've been on that campus. It's a lovely campus. And shout out to my friend Marina Yvette Franklin, graduate of Syracuse, who I used to visit up there. And yes, depending on what time of year you come, it's gorgeous. Or you may need to just hunker down and sort of live wherever you land for a while. So they do have some recruiting challenges there. He plays a very fun, up-tempo offense. It should be the kind of offense that running backs, wide receivers, and quarterbacks should be drawn to. But it is also a program that has struggled at times to find those what I call Florida, Texas, California positions, right? Those players that you tend to get from those states. It may be a little hard to sell some of those guys, though, coming all the way up to Syracuse. And once again, the state of New York has major population centers, but they tend to struggle to produce certain positions. So you've got to get creative. And like I said, work the portal. So now I just want to spend the rest of our time together on some matchups that you are really excited about. Looking through the schedule, what do you think are some of the most impactful, important games, and what games you sort of circled, as you look at the season to figure out, okay, I got to see this, I want to see this, and why are those the games you chose?
Well, I think with the ACC, it definitely begins and ends with Florida State going to Clemson. It's kind of returned to its status as the top ACC game, one of the top games nationally. That's one that's going to be circled on everyone's schedule to watch.
Right.
You've got Clemson going to NC State, which NC State always has a tremendous environment, and we talked about they could be one of those dark horse teams to keep an eye on. Florida State's got to go to Pittsburgh, another one of the dark horse teams to keep an eye on. Out of conference, Florida State playing LSU.
Yeah.
Early in the season is one that could kind of set the tone for the season
Right.
completely. I think everyone that might be the matchup of the early season between top 10 teams. I know Notre Dame plays Ohio State. I think is another huge one as well. But that is definitely that game in Orlando going to be one of the top two or three matchups of the year out of conference. You got Notre Dame coming down to Death Valley this year, and Notre Dame's on some crazy long regular season winning streak against ACC teams. So that's an opportunity for an ACC team to defeat Notre Dame, and it's always a big event when the Irish, come to town. So I mean, right now the schedule, does kind of is gravitating towards the Florida State and Clemson matchups. But if you're looking a little bit under the radar, Duke and North Carolina, we know about the basketball matchup, but I mean, think about that quarterback game. The two quarterbacks in that game this year, Duke coming off a 9-win season, Riley Leonard and Drake May. That's going to be a lot of fun and a great atmosphere. Pittsburgh playing West Virginia in the backyard brawl. What a
Yes, I'm
great
so
game
glad that game being played again.
yeah, it's so good. It's such a great rivalry. So, a lot of game and another one that I think could be really pivotal um, is Miami playing Texas A&M. I mean, we know about Texas A&M. They have talent, but they just cratered last year, and somehow then they beat LSU at the end of the year. But that's a big opportunity for Miami to jumpstart their season. If they knock off Texas A&M, and even though the Aggies may not be that great, we know they have talent, and that could really get them going early in the season.
Yeah. Well, Texas A&M is you won't be here when we talk about Texas A&M, but my prediction is that even if they lose that game, Texas A&M will like knock off somebody like Alabama or something, because you just don't know who that team is from one week to the next. The same Texas A&M that will lose to a team that ends up winning 7 or 8 games will also knock off the eventual national championship, because that's who they are as a program. Just confusing. First of all, I do want to thank you so much. It is a real pleasure. Can you tell people, Jeffrey, where they can find your work and follow you on your various social media platforms?
Yeah, absolutely. You can find me on Twitter at Talking ACC Sports, especially once the season gets going. I'll be definitely tweeting about the games, what's going on with the ACC. Right now, we're doing some player previews on the ACC. Top 5 players at each position. Some of them we've talked about today. That's at allsportsdiscussion.com, and we're also going through our ACC team previews on our podcast with myself and at ASD_Hokie Smash is my co-host on that.
Okay.
And we got about 3 more teams to do in the ACC. We usually grab a ACC blogger from that team or someone that covers that team from the media. Sometimes it's even just a fan who's really knowledgeable on their team. So we're finishing up on that. So get you ready for the season.
Okay.
I think the ACC is kind of trending in the right direction again after some really lean years there, prior to 2022, that 2019, 2020, 2021 kind of things kind of fell the bottom fell out, to be honest. There was some kind of crazy 12-game losing streak in the bowls, and there weren't very many noteworthy out of conference wins, but started to turn last year, and I think the move is in the right direction again.
Agreed. Once again, I cannot urge you enough. If you care even a little bit of ACC sports, this is the man, Jeffery Fann. Once again, thank you so much for your time, your talent, your attention. I will definitely be checking out all the stuff you're doing on all the other platforms, and I will have you on again at some point during the season, probably as we get closer to, towards the end of the season, setting up for bowl games and conference championships, things like that, to talk about the season, looking back at it, to see what things we talked about we were right about, what things we were wrong about. Yep. But once again, I can't help but just say what a pleasure it is to have you, because, like I said, you're as good as it gets. So thank you.
I appreciate that, Bill. Really, really enjoyed it, and it was a good time. And hearing you go through the ACC recruiting, I mean, I definitely could not have done that.
Well, here's what, and I'm not really, I mean, compared to people I know who do it full time, but I mess with it a little bit. Here's what I like about recruiting. Now there's information is fairly easy to get your hands on. I'm old enough to remember when you used to have to like talk to people, who talk to somebody, heard about this kid, and you drive across state lines and stand in the pouring rain. I don't have to do all that foolishness anymore, so it's not as hard as it used to be. But once again, I do want to thank you. I will look forward to the next time we speak. So that was once again pleasure. We just had Jeffery Fann here on College Football Forecast. He is really, like I said, just about the best that there is. So as I get ready to wrap up, we're going to be walking through, obviously, the rest of the Power Fives, Big 10, Big 12, and then, Pac-12, and then finishing up, of course, with the SEC. Then we'll have one big combined show to walk our way through Group of 5, and then we'll have our small school forecast show. We break that up into maybe 2 because there's a lot of small school programs to get to. So maybe do one that's FBS and D2, and maybe one that's like NAIA. Well, we'll figure it out. But I do want to let you all know I very much thank you so much. This is obviously my passion and my joy. We will do this again in 1 week. Thank you.